8:42 a.m. in Riyadh. On a satellite feed monitored out of Tampa, Florida, a plume of smoke rises over the Saudi port town of Yanbu. Minutes earlier, Houthi fighters in Yemen fired missiles and drones at facilities tied to Saudi Aramco, the largest oil company on earth. A second strike hits Jizan, further south on the Red Sea coast. This is signal number 1. The war that everyone thought was cooling down just found a new front. For nearly 2 weeks straight, American aircraft had been hitting targets inside Iran, night after night. Then, without warning, the strikes stopped. 2 nights of silence from Washington. But silence from one side of this war does not mean silence everywhere. And that is exactly what nobody is telling you, because while the guns went quiet over Tehran, they got louder over the Red Sea. The Houthis, Iran's last functioning proxy force, just reminded the world they can still reach Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure whenever they choose. There's a third actor in this story. Not Iran, not Israel, not even the Houthis. We'll come back to that. For now, picture the map. The Strait of Hormuz to the east, the al-Mandeb Strait to the southwest. 2 choke points, 1 war, and a global economy that runs through both of them. This war did not start last week. It started on February 28th, when American and Israeli warplanes hit Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure in a campaign aimed, officials said at the time, at forcing regime change. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in those opening strikes. Let that sink in. The man who had ruled the Islamic Republic since 1989 did not survive the first days of this war. Iran hit back. Missiles at American bases, missiles at Israel, and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway that carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil. Oil prices reacted instantly. By late July, Brent crude had climbed from just over $71 a barrel on July 1st to above $100 a barrel, the highest level in months. That is signal number 2. When oil crosses $100 during an active war, markets stop pricing in tension. They start pricing in duration. Here's the secret offer nobody wants to say out loud. In June, Pakistan brokered a memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran. A ceasefire, a 60-day clock for negotiations. Under that framework, Iran would remove its enriched uranium stockpile. Limits would be placed on its missile program. In exchange, the guns would fall silent and the Strait of Hormuz would reopen for good. It sounded, for a moment, like an ending. Then the shuttle diplomacy began. And shuttle diplomacy in this war means one thing. Nobody trusts anybody enough to sit in the same room. Steve Witkoff, the president's Middle East envoy, has been sending messages to Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Not meetings, messages. Araghchi has said it himself, in his own words, to journalists. He receives communications from Witkoff directly, but that does not mean negotiations are happening. Everything moves through intermediaries. Now the story is about whether anyone else can drag them back into it, whether they want to or not. The Houthis are the newest wild card. They had gone quiet on Red Sea shipping attacks since the Gaza ceasefire in October of last year. Their leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, has now declared, in his own words, that the group's hands are on the trigger whenever developments require it. That is not a group standing down. That is a group waiting for a signal. And in late March, they got one. The Houthis resumed missile strikes on Israel, tying their fate formally to Iran's war, and reopening the exact shipping lane that global trade spent most of last year trying to road around. Jordan has now been pulled in too. Its military intercepted 6 Iranian missiles in a single day, with 2 of them landing in remote areas of the kingdom. An attack on Aqaba. Jordan's Red Sea port city, sitting right next to the Israeli resort town of Qatar's prime minister, has served as courier. Pakistani officials have shuttled between capitals. Even Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, has sat in on rounds of this indirect dance from Doha to a resort in Switzerland that at one point had talks planned and then abruptly postponed. This is not diplomacy the way people picture it. There's no big table, no handshake, no cameras. It is envoys landing in Muscat, in Islamabad, in Doha, carrying paper back and forth between 2 governments that fought a shooting war for weeks and still do not fully believe the other side wants peace. And here is the catch. Even when Washington and Tehran inch toward an agreement, the deal has a saboteur problem. Israel is not a party to the Pakistan-mediated talks. It sat out the negotiating table entirely. And that has left Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in an uncomfortable position, watching a deal get written about his most dangerous enemy without him in the room. Netanyahu has said Iran enters this pause battered, weaker than ever, and that Israel's finger remains on the trigger. That is not the language of a man who considers the war finished. Israel's own hardliners have gone further. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir called elements of the emerging framework a major mistake and declared that Washington's agreement does not bind Israel. Inside Iran, the mirror image exists. Hardliners tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have spent years torpedoing negotiations they viewed as capitulation. going back to the original nuclear deal collapse under the first Trump administration. So you have two governments trying to build a ceasefire, and on each side, a faction whose entire political identity depends on the war continuing. That is the real fault line running underneath every headline about progress. Now here's the geopolitical domino nobody has fully connected yet. When Israel invaded southern Lebanon to fight Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, it nearly wrecked the entire US-Iran framework before the ink dried. A ceasefire in Lebanon had to be separately negotiated, just to keep the larger Iran deal alive. One front stabilizes, and the tremor threatens to collapse the whole structure standing next to it. That is how this war works. It is not one war. It is 6 or 7 wars, stacked on top of each other, each one capable of dragging the others back into open combat. Which brings us back to that third actor. Iran has publicly accused Ukraine of targeting an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf. In the same week, the Red Sea flared up again. Think about how strange that sentence is. A war that began over Iran's nuclear program has now pulled in accusations involving Ukraine in a sea that borders Russia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia. This is what escalation actually looks like. It does not stay in its lane. Here's the pivot. For weeks, the story was about whether Washington and Tehran could hold their ceasefire. Was detected, but did not draw an Israeli response because the missile posed no direct threat. President Trump, in blunt remarks, appeared to blame Jordan for the deaths of American personnel at a remote airbase in the country's northeast, saying missiles had slipped through gaps in the kingdom's air defenses. Jordan is a U.S. security ally. It is also now functionally a battlefield. Here's the second catch. All of this, the Jordan strikes, the Aqaba near miss, the Yanbu and Jizan attacks, happened during a pause, during the part of the war when the guns were supposed to be quieting down. Escalation and de-escalation are not opposites right now. They are happening in the same 48-hour window, on different fronts, sometimes in the same news cycle. So what happens if the Bab el-Mandeb Strait becomes what the Strait of Hormuz already was, for weeks, functionally closed? Roughly 10% of global seaborne trade moves through that corridor in a normal year, carrying container ships and oil tankers between Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Shipping giants like Maersk had only just begun cautiously returning to Red Sea routes after more than a year of rerouting around the entire African continent, adding as much as 10 to 14 days to voyages between Asia and Europe. A renewed Houthi campaign threatens to send that traffic back around the Cape of Good Hope all over again. That means higher freight costs, higher insurance premiums for tankers, and another leg up for oil prices already sitting above $100 a barrel for the first time since May. Every dollar increase in the price of Brent crude ripples into diesel prices, into airline fuel surcharges, into the cost of shipping a container of anything, anywhere. War in a choke point does not stay contained to the region where the missiles land. It shows up in a gas station receipt on the other side of the planet. The financial cost of the American side of this war alone has already been staggering. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has told Congress the campaign against Iran has cost $37.5 billion, and the administration is asking lawmakers for billions more. That is the price tag before you even count the economic damage of a prolonged closure at either choke point. Analysts have warned that a sustained shutdown of Hormuz alone could send oil well past $120 a barrel, feeding directly into inflation numbers that central banks around the world are already nervous about. Here's what nobody is telling you plainly enough. A ceasefire on paper is not the same thing as peace on the ground. This war has a Pakistan-brokered memorandum. It does not yet have compliance, verification, or trust. It has envoys sending messages through Doha and Islamabad. It does not have Araghchi and Witkoff shaking hands on camera. It has a Strait of Hormuz that reopened. It has a Bab el-Mandeb Strait that just took missile fire on Saturday. It has a Lebanon ceasefire holding, barely, after Israeli strikes killed 182 people in a single day at the height of the crisis. It has an Israeli government publicly split on whether the entire framework should even survive. And it has hardliners on every side of this conflict, from the IRGC to Netanyahu's own governing coalition, for whom a lasting peace deal is not a victory. It is a threat to their political survival. That is the real war happening right now, underneath the missiles, a war between the people trying to end this thing and the people who need it to continue. The next 24 to 72 hours will tell us which side is winning that argument. If Iran hands over its enriched uranium stockpile and the Houthis stand down from the Red Sea, the 60-day clock on this ceasefire might actually reach zero with a real deal attached to it. If instead the Houthis escalate further, if Israel's hardliners force Netanyahu's hand, or if the IRGC convinces Tehran that this pause is just American weakness, the strikes resume. And this time, they may not stop at Iran's borders. Peace or war. A signed deal or another round of tomahawks in the night. Right now, in the Red Sea, in the Strait of Hormuz, and in quiet rooms in Doha and Islamabad, that choice is being made in real time. And the rest of the world is about to find out which way it breaks.